Welcome to a new episode of Üretim Bandı. Welcome to the podcast, Teresa. It's nice to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with why we're doing this because, I came across your blog maybe 6-7 years ago as I was doing some searching as I was a junior PM back then. I was trying to figure out this whole PMing thing. And I was trying to understand how to be a better PM, basically. And I came across, I don't remember which ones, but I came across your post at the time. And that's how I met you. But then you've published this great book, Continuous Discovery Habits. And so thanks for that. We're able to have this conversation. So thanks again for taking the time. I have to say it's a really great book. I will put it in the show notes for everyone to see. And you're very into the topic of discovery. Discovery is important for you. So I want to know, like, what made you go into that topic? What made you think that, okay, this is something that's missing in the market? Way back when you started this coaching job, like there must be a reason why you're focusing on that area.
Yeah, so I had worked at a series of startups in the San Francisco Bay Area in a number of different roles, and what I saw was that the same problem existed everywhere. Most product teams weren't spending enough time with their customers. Decisions were being made by leadership teams who weren't spending any time with customers, and it just felt like everybody was guessing, and it didn't really work very well. And then I talked with friends that were also in the industry, and they were seeing the same thing at their organizations. And I had been introduced to human-centered design really early in my career, actually, as a college student. I naively thought that was just how business worked. And then when I saw over and over and over again that wasn't really how companies worked, I realized that was a pretty important problem to work on, and I wanted to help teams figure out how to do that. And in talking to other product people, I realized it wasn't that they didn't want to, it's that they just didn't know that they should. They didn't know how to get started. They didn't know how to make it a part of their practice. So I decided to focus on solving that problem.
Is that the biggest challenge that you see right now between, let's say, fully discovery-oriented team versus a team that doesn't really do any discovery? Just not knowing where to start?
Yeah, it's a few things. I think there's a couple categories. So there's some teams that have literally never talked to a customer before. Their organizational culture doesn't require it, doesn't encourage it, maybe even puts roadblockers up to prevent them from doing it. And so I think those teams just really have no idea where to start, and they just need an easy first step. I think there's a number of teams, especially now as we're starting to see discovery get a lot more trendy, that are engaging with customers, but they're doing it sporadically. They're doing it when it's convenient. And maybe they don't, most of us weren't trained as researchers. We don't necessarily know how to collect reliable insights. And so maybe they're not getting the most out of those customer engagements. So it's kind of a spectrum. And it's easy when you go to conferences and read blogs and read books thinking everybody's doing this now. But the reality is most people are in that first category of they haven't had a lot of interaction with customers. Their company doesn't really support it. And they're really just looking for, how do I get better at this?
And the interesting thing is that it's, on one hand, very easy, as in, like, you just talk to customers. I mean, there's not much to it. But on the other hand, okay, I talk to a customer, but how do I extract the information that's actually necessary for me? So it's like on both ends, like it's actually easy to start because you just pick up a phone, or even right now in COVID times, it's even easier because you just hop on a Zoom call. But I think one thing that I've seen in many teams who haven't really talked to customers is like, okay, fine, I'll talk to a customer, but what do I ask? Like, what's the question in my mind?
Yeah, a lot of teams get hung up on this. They're worried they're going to do something wrong. And I like to tell teams that if you know how to have a beer with a friend or a coffee with a friend and ask them about their day, you know how to interview. That's sort of the first step. Like, just go have a normal human conversation with your customer, be curious, learn about their lives, learn about what their day-to-day looks like. From there, you want to think about, how do you increase the reliability of what you're hearing in your interviews? And it's not rocket science. It's really like the tip I give in the book is to keep the interview grounded in specific stories about the past. It's not this mind-blowingly hard idea, but it does take practice because story-based interviewing violates a conversation norm that most of us abide by, which is in a typical conversation, we're sharing the airspace 50-50. Whereas in a typical interview, we want the interviewee doing most of the talking. And so the reason why it takes practice is because we have to just get comfortable with that. And we have to learn how to facilitate that type of conversation. But even before you get good at that, you're still going to get tremendous value just from having a regular conversation with customers. And then once that's under your belt, you can start looking at how do I get even more value out of this by asking the right questions, by building my skill, by practicing this form of interviewing.
Have you come across not interviewers, but interviewees where they weren't really comfortable with the interview either? Like they didn't know how to be the interviewee?
Yeah, so this happens for a few reasons. So sometimes we're asking about topics that our participants not comfortable sharing. And I think in those instances, to do the ethical thing is to pull back, right? And to recognize that participants should only share what they feel comfortable sharing. Sometimes it's just a personality trait, like it's somebody who's shy or introverted, or they're just not very verbose in their responses. And that's where it's really on the interviewer to help them tell their story. And I think that's the skill part. That's where it takes a lot of practice to make that feel comfortable and not that they're being interrogated. And that's where, we've all met that person who is really skilled at interviewing or in conversation where it's just easy to talk to them. It's easy to kind of share your story. And I think that is the skill of interviewing. And then the other thing to know is that one thing I advocate for is that you interview continuously. So you're interviewing a customer every week. The more you interview, the less costly a not so good interview is, right? So if you only interview occasionally and you meet someone who's really struggling to tell their story, it's going to feel really disappointing. But if you know you have another interview in just a few days, it's not a big deal. And then you don't have to pressure the person. You don't have to interrogate them. You can just let it go and say, all right, well, I feel like you've shared what you wanted to. Let's move on.
And one thing I've seen is sometimes they expect a lot. The expectations are really high from just one interview, as opposed like they're trying to find, okay, have I hit the gold mine with this interview versus like looking for a pattern within a time, let's say, or within dozens of interviews, let's say.
Yeah, the biggest mistake I see people make is they assume this is the only time they're ever going to talk to a customer, and they ask 400 questions. They're trying to learn everything in a single interview. And that doesn't really lead to depth in an interview, right? So I want to see teams come up with one or two story-based questions, spend most of the time digging deep in those stories, understanding the context, understanding the nuance, and not pepper someone with 3-page discussion guides of here's everything I hope to ever learn about my customer. It's exhausting, and you end up collecting a bunch of facts that lose context. Whereas if you focus on story-based interviewing, you get rich stories, you get the context in which your product is going to exist, and you really start to uncover unmet needs, which is the purpose of interviewing.
I think one of the main things that you prioritize in this book is the fact that it's continuous. I mean, it's the first word of the book, the title. And I think that's one thing that's maybe a bit different than what we've seen in other sources. And it kind of makes that into not like this is a research project, but this is something that you do every day, week, month, whatever. I mean, it's more like, it becomes more like in Agile, there's stand-up daily meetings where you meet with a team every day. Just like that, it doesn't have an outcome on its own. Like it does, like, what did I achieve in this daily stand-up? It doesn't have a KPI there, but it's something that you do every day. So it's kind of like that, as I've seen from your book. It's like you have to do this, but don't expect like an outcome from every single meeting.
Yeah, I think it just becomes your way of working. So the continuous piece is really important to me. I think most of us grew up in a project world. Most companies still work on a project cadence. But what we're seeing is that the world doesn't operate on a project cadence, right? The world is constantly changing around us. Customer needs are constantly changing. We saw in 2020 that the world changed pretty radically overnight in a way that nobody could have predicted. And for a lot of teams, what that meant was their roadmap suddenly shifted. Their customers' needs suddenly shifted. The mass migration to working from home and working remotely had a huge impact on what people needed from software and what they needed from the products they used every day. Hopefully, we're not going to live through multiple global pandemics in our lives, right? But Here's what does happen on a regular basis. We see new competitors enter our market. We see new technology disrupt what we're building. Even just our own code releases have a big impact on the opportunity landscape, on really understanding what do customers need. And so I think that piece of it has to be continuous. If we want to serve our customers over time, we have to keep our ear to the ground and make sure we're continuously engaging with our customers and understanding how their world works today so that tomorrow we're not surprised. And when something happens that disrupts the market, we're there and we're able to catch it early and we're able to respond quickly. So I think what's happened in the age of the internet is that our pace of development has quickened, our ability to change our software has quickened, our ability to respond to the market has quickened, but only if we're doing that work to stay close to the customer. And we see a lot of companies take our old software in a box model and apply it to the internet world where they're releasing quarterly or they're releasing once a year. And they're really not taking advantage of what the internet really unlocks for us, which is continuous feedback loops and the ability to continuously adapt.
I think I'd like to talk about this at the beginning of the interview or the conversation, because I think that's one thing that people always think about. Okay, I mean, this is great, but my company culture is not like that. My founders aren't really, let's say, customer centric. I'm sure you've heard this like maybe hundreds of times, but I can hear that at the back of my mind, people asking about this while we are having this conversation. So what do you say to those challenges, let's say?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, your leadership would support this. And for the teams that I coach, the head of product brought me in because the company is trying to move to a continuous cadence. And that's a really nice luxury to have because you have support from leadership. The organization is starting to move in this direction. But I would say that's a teeny tiny percentage of companies. So I also teach a ton of students who come through my Product Talk Academy. And that's individuals that work at companies where their leaders are not necessarily saying, let's work this way. They just individually want to develop their own skills and they want to start to learn to work this way. And what's great is regardless of what's happening in your organizational context, any individual contributor, whether that's a product manager, a designer, a software engineer, they can start to develop their own outcome mindset. They can start to increase the frequency in which they engage with customers. They can start to develop their understanding of the opportunity space. They can start testing their assumptions. They can run this whole process even if their organization doesn't support it. And I work with students that are still living in a world where they're being told, here's a roadmap, deliver these specific features. And they still build better versions of those features if they do the work to understand what outcomes are we trying to drive, who's my customer, what are their unmet needs, how can I shape these outputs to meet those needs in a way that drives those outcomes. So even if for those listening where their organization looks nothing like this, even if nothing in your organization changes, the habits in the book will still help you individually do your job better and help you better serve your customer and in a lot of ways better serve your company.
Yeah, so we're not actually trying to change the entire culture we're not trying to make the company more like a discovery oriented company, but rather how can I make the feature in front of me better?
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, your company would change, right? But here's the challenge with organizational change. It's slow. Every organizational change is really just a collection of individual people trying to change at different rates. And so it's chaotic and it's messy. And some people take 2 steps forward and other people bring you 2 steps back. And so you could try to influence that, but the odds are most individual contributors have very little influence on how their organizational context is going to work. And most people are going to drive themselves nuts even trying. Whereas I think you can have a huge impact by looking at your own sphere of influence, what you can change, which is the way you individually work and how your peers around you work. You can create what Chip and Dan Heath call bright spots in the organization. So a bright spot is a little tiny island that's performing better, right? And so if you start to change the way you work, you become a bright spot. You get better results. You build better outputs. You drive more outcomes. And what happens is everybody else in the organization is going to start to get curious about how you're working. And that's when you can start to build that influence and be able to have an impact on the organizational culture. But if you don't first change the way you work and you just come in and say, hey, there's this new way of working and everybody's talking about it and we should do this, you're just going to engage in this ideological battle that really is not going to be successful. So I really like to encourage people is just start with your own work. First of all, it's easy. And second of all, it's actually the best way to influence the rest of the organization.
And actually, they don't have to they don't have to do like hours and hours and hours of research at the very, very first project. They can just start with a weekly cadence, as you mentioned in your book. Just an hour a week is a good start, right?
And a lot of people are going to struggle with the weekly cadence right out of the gate. So I recommend just find your first customer to talk to. That's it. Just talk to one customer. And then after you've done that, work on finding your second one. And then after you've done that, start thinking about how you can increase the frequency until you start to get closer and closer to that weekly cadence. And what's nice about that is that, I meet plenty of product people that are in meetings all day, every day. They're double booked. They don't have a lot of time, but we all can carve out 20 to 30 minutes to find it, to go talk to a customer. And if we can't, we're doing something radically wrong, right? So if you're listening and you're feeling like you can't even find 30 minutes, I would literally print out your week, print out the calendar for the week, take a red pen and start finding meetings you can stop going to, because you're going to have a hard time building products that your customers care about if you have zero interaction with them.
So let's assume that we have the chance to encourage and maybe even change the behavior of the management. How can management be more discovery centric, or how can they do discovery better? How can management do discovery better? How can they be more customer centric?
Yeah, so I think the role leaders play is around really setting the strategic context for their team. So helping teams understand these are the outcomes, these are the metrics that matter to our business. These are the ones that are most important at this point in time. So setting the scope of the discovery work. I think the other role they can play is supporting the culture of good discovery. So I like to see leaders in one-on-ones ask their teams, when was the last time you talked to a customer? What did you learn from them that surprised you? Both of those questions sort of hold teams accountable to a continuous cadence. And the question, what did you learn that surprised you, helps keep on the forefront that if you're not learning things that are surprising you every single week, you're probably falling prey to confirmation bias. And you need to look at how do you get better at your research methods. So I think really the role of the leader is to set a good outcome and then to help reinforce the culture on a regular basis that we need to be engaging with our customers. We need to be testing our assumptions. We need to be constantly learning things that surprise us, because no matter how much discovery we do, no matter how much we know about our customers, every customer is still unique and there's always more to learn.
Is there a way to track how customer centric you are, how close you are to the customer, or how discovery oriented you are from it doesn't have to be on a management level. It can be on any level. But the question is basically coming from, if you can track it, if it's on a dashboard somewhere, people are going to ask about it. People are going to promote. People are going to push it. So I'm thinking, is there a way to put this on a dashboard? How can you?
Yeah. So I look at this as there's two dimensions to this. First is the habits, right? Are you adopting the habits in a way that they're becoming sustainable? So one metric I look at for a product team is, what's the cycle time between customer touch points? So some people count customer touch points, but I could say interview 12 customers in a quarter, and one team could interview all 12 in the last 2 weeks, and the other could interview one a week. And the one that's interviewing one a week is in a much better position. So rather than counting customer touch points, which by the way is a vanity metric, it always goes up, is I look at the cycle time between customer touch points. So if you're interviewing once a week, that should be 7 days. You can obviously bring that down even further. But if you're interviewing once a month, you're at 30 days, you want to bring that number down. The other thing I like to look at is the turnaround time for an assumption test. So again, some people count assumption tests, and I think that actually leads to, it's easy to game, it leads to bad behavior, you test the wrong things. But looking at how long does it take to collect data on an assumption test? So are your assumption tests taking 3 weeks to collect data? Are they taking 3 days? Can you get them down to 1 day? Can you get them down to a few hours? That helps do a few things. Usually you have to set up some infrastructure to get your assumption test timing to be really quick. And then the shorter your assumption test time, the more likely you're going to run assumption tests in parallel and get to a really good compare and contrast decision on which solutions really look best. So the two kind of habit metrics that I like to measure are cycle time between customer touch points and the turnaround time for collecting data on an assumption test. But ultimately, the measure of discovery is the impact you're having on your outcome. And are you able to drive your outcome over time? And that doesn't mean you're always driving your outcome and you always have wins and you're always getting better quarter over quarter. But a team that has good discovery habits should be having a bigger impact on their outcome than a team that doesn't.
One thing that is very central in your the books, the talks, and everything that you've written so far, this is all about the product trio. It's all about the builders, and it's not just about the product manager or the designer, who are, let's say, quote unquote, they're supposed to be closer to the customer anyway, but you're including the engineer as well. You call them a product trio, which I love. And you've actually given them equal accountability, right? This is not this designer's job. This is not the product manager's job. This is all your job. I mean, it's all three of you, and you're equally responsible. So how do you infuse that idea into the teams when you first start with them?
Yeah, so let's first talk about why this matters. So in some organizations, we look at the UX designer as the voice of the customer, and they work with the UX researchers, and they go do all the research, and they bring it back to the team. In some organizations, that's the product manager. In very few organizations is the engineer involved in either case. And what's wrong with that? Let's say that we let the product manager do all the research. Now when the trio is having a decision about what to build, it's really easy for the product manager to say, well, this is what the customer wants. And the designer and the engineer have no response to that. It's like a trump card. And so what happens when one person on the team has that trump card of knowing what the customer wants, we don't get true cross-functional collaboration. So the engineer's opinion gets trumped by what the customer wants. And so we don't leverage the technical expertise of the engineer. And when we don't leverage all three roles of expertise, we don't end up with the best products. This is what we saw in Waterfall, right? A product manager wrote requirements, they got handed to the designer. The designer ran into design constraints. We rewrote the requirements. The requirements and the design get handed to the engineers. They run into a data model problem. We rewrite requirements. We redo design. It's slow. It leads to rework. And it doesn't lead to the best products, right? Because instead of starting from the beginning, looking at, we have business constraints, we have design constraints, we have technical constraints. Given that, how do we collectively determine the best product to solve, the best solution for our customers? We're not leveraging all of that expertise at once. And so we're building less than optimal solutions. So by having the trio engage with customers together, they all have the trump card. Nobody can trump each other. They all have a shared understanding of the customer. And we're truly drawing on design expertise, product expertise, and engineering expertise. And we're getting to better decisions sooner. And it's a little counterintuitive because a lot of people think we need our engineers writing code. We do. But they also have a few hours every week to devote to understanding the customer and hearing about customer problems and brainstorming solutions and testing assumptions. Like, this does not have to be a big, heavy process. And the outcome is you end up with better solutions that are easier to build because the engineering mindset was brought in from the very beginning. So all of the time that your engineers spend in discovery is going to be saved in not having rework and delivery.
It's interesting because, I mean, yes, they are hired to code, but they're hired to build something. So, and in order to build something, you got to know what the problem is, and you have to understand what the problem is. And I mean, in my experience, I've actually gotten a lot of great ideas from engineers because the product manager, the designer, obviously is not as technical as the software developer, and the software developer can come up with a much better, let's say, feature, but a much better solution to the problem. In some cases. So I think all hands on deck should be the motto.
Yeah, here's the analogy. Let's imagine that you hire this Michelin star chef to cook you dinner. And then you say, here's what I want you to make. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, you might feel like here's what I want you to make is an appropriate thing to say to that chef because you have dietary restrictions and you have a really particular palate and you want to communicate that. But instead of communicating, I have dietary restrictions and here's my palate, you're communicating, make hot dogs, which doesn't take any advantage of what this Michelin star chef is bringing, right? So the idea of a product trio is we're each bringing constraints to the table and we're collaborating together. So in this chef example, what we want to say to that chef is, my kid doesn't eat dairy and I personally don't like beans, but we really want a delicious meal and we know that you're in the best situation to design that delicious meal. Right? So it's more about how do we get the group together to collaborate from the beginning So we can leverage everybody's expertise. We can let that chef shine and use their culinary skills to come up with an amazing meal while meeting the rest of the team's constraints.
To be honest, I think the engineers are also more, they're happier this way because they're more involved. They're more involved. They can see the customer. They can see the impact that they're having on the real world rather than just, okay, I deployed some code.
Yeah, definitely. I think all three roles are happier. And the funny thing is that sometimes the product manager has to let go that they're not making all the decisions, or sometimes the designer has to let go of the fact that they're not the voice of the customer. And it feels a little bit like they're giving up some power in the old model. But I've worked with plenty of teams that have gone through this transition, and out the other side, all three roles are happier. All three roles have a lot more fun. Humans were meant to solve problems. Humans were meant to collaborate. I think it's how we naturally work, but our organizational culture and our business environment has sort of moved us away from that. And I think the product trio idea is moving us back to how we naturally work.
So about the decision-making structure or the systems inside the product trio. So personally, I've had some challenges on that area in my previous company, as in that, I mean, it wasn't a big challenge, but like sometimes things weren't clear who was supposed to give what decision. So what is your framework on that? Because we call this a trio and this is a team and this is a teamwork, but thinking about the opportunity solution tree, like the outcome is given, or at least that's clear, but the opportunities, the solutions, and even the assumptions are a bit more subjective, as in like in terms of how you prioritize them. So how does the product trio members, how do they decide? Who decides on what?
Yeah, you know what? I get this question all the time, and it's because most of us work in organizations where we're not cross-functionally collaborating. We're falling back on our silos. We still say the product manager decides when it's this type of decision, and the engineer decides when it's this type of decision, and the designer decides when it's this type of decision. I don't think that's good. I think to be a truly functioning trio, the trio decides. And we have not seen what this looks like because again, our organizations encourage us to fall back on our silos. But if you are truly doing your discovery together and you have a shared understanding of the customer context, the outcome that you're going after, the opportunities that you're hearing, most of the time you are going to agree on a decision. When you don't, you can test your disagreement. So let's say you're prioritizing opportunities, and the vast majority of the time, and I've done this with hundreds of teams, the vast majority of the time, the team is going to agree on their target opportunity. When they don't, and it's because they're starting from a shared understanding. So this assumes you're doing your discovery together, you're interviewing together. That's what leads to most of the time you agree. Sometimes maybe there's a slight disagreement. There's two opportunities you can't decide between. That's where you can run a quick test. You can, in your interviews, start to evaluate what are we hearing more often? What do we think is most important? And you can use data to help you arbitrate that disagreement. Same with solutions, right? Like it's not that somebody is picking which solution you go after. You're running assumption tests looking for a clear front runner. And if you don't have a clear front runner, if some person still loves A and somebody else still loves B, you should be looking for C that is the clear front runner that everybody agrees is the clear front runner. So usually we have disagreements because we haven't found a good enough option. We're not done. We need to still be looking. And when we do find a clear front runner, both in the opportunity space and both in the solution space, it's really easy to come to agreement because the data is telling us this is a clear front runner.
The framework that you outlined is a very clear framework it starts from the outcome all the way to the assumption test. Does gut or instinct play any role in this framework, or is it always go towards the assumption test?
So you're never going to remove subjective decision making from discovery, ever, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to make more informed bets. Even picking an outcome is a bet. Choosing a target opportunity is a bet. Choosing which solutions to run assumption tests are a bet. Choosing which assumptions to test are a bet. So there's subjectivity throughout the whole process. The key is, are you surfacing your assumptions? Are you making your thinking explicit? Are you aligning as a team? Are you making sure that you're leveraging everybody's expertise? That's really what the process is designed to do. so that in the end, when you put something in your backlog, it's a better bet. That's it. It's still a bet though, right? So the whole goal of this process is to make better bets. You're never going to remove the uncertainty. You're never going to remove the ambiguity. You're never going to have a perfect hit rate. There's still going to be times where you release something that falls short of the impact. What that means is you have an opportunity to learn what assumptions you should have tested that you didn't, right? So this process is still subjective, but we're trying to use data and testing and externalizing our thinking and examining our thinking to get better at making bets.
Sometimes, some work that we do as product teams, unfortunately, there is not much area to discover. It's just, let's say, like regulatory changes or like really, I don't know, some investor wanted us to do it or some big customer wanted us to do it. And we all have all those features. And sometimes we got to do them. And sometimes, like, if it's a large company, let's say like one part of the business is acting like a cash cow, as in like we just execute, and there's not much discovery area. But one part of the business is, all right, we're looking for a new space or we're looking for a new solution, and it's more exploratory. So I think there are a couple of frameworks in this area of like Horizon 1 to 3, like exploitation versus exploration. As far as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the discovery methodology is more towards the exploration side. But I'm wondering if exploitation, and I'm only talking about exploitation in that framework, like exploitation versus exploration, I wonder if like discovery plays a role in that as well.
I think discovery plays a role in both, but you're going to do a lot more discovery in the exploration. Because here's the goal of discovery. Our goal with discovery is to mitigate risk, right? Anytime we're spending resources, we're building something, there's risk that we're building the wrong thing. So our goal in discovery is to mitigate as much of that risk as possible. When we're talking about exploration, our Horizon 2s, or especially our Horizon 3, there's a lot more risk. There's a lot more unknowns. So we're going to invest a lot more discovery. However, even in exploitation in Horizon 1, there's still risk. You could do something that puts that cash cow at risk, right? So we still have risk there, but maybe in Horizon 1, our discovery is more usability discovery, more health metrics, what's the impact on our health metrics discovery, and less go out and explore, make big bets, look for big home runs, right? But I would argue there is discovery in both. It's just the amount of discovery you're doing may look a little bit different. The type of discovery might look a little bit different. I think you're still using the exact same habits, but in your exploration discovery, you're probably testing a lot more desirability assumptions. Maybe you're doing a lot more feasibility assumptions if it's taking advantage of new technology. Whereas in your Horizon 1, you might be doing a lot more usability assumptions, making sure you're not breaking anything, and doing a lot more viability assumptions, making sure that you're not putting that cash cow business model at risk.
Does the stage of the company matter in terms of how you do discovery?
I think the habits stay the same, but where you're spending your time might look a little bit different. So a mature product probably has a customer journey. You already have an understanding of the customer journey. You're optimizing parts of the product. If you're just responsible for maintaining the success of an existing product, you're probably looking at optimizing a journey. Maybe you're looking for a new opportunity here or there that will differentiate your product from the competitors. But it's probably a tighter journey, a tighter opportunity space. If you're a brand new company, you don't even have a product yet, you're probably discovering what that journey is. You're probably discovering whole branches of the tree that are going to differentiate you. So what the work looks like, I think, is exactly the same, but how it's shaped, how broad your tree is, how narrow your tree is, what opportunities you choose to go after, the maturity of how you're measuring your outcome might look a little bit different. But I do think these habits were developed in a lot of organizational contexts. I've worked with teams that were a 2-person founding team. I've worked with companies that are multinational organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees. And my goal was to identify what are the habits with the underlying structure that's common everywhere. And then how you're spending your time might look a little bit differently depending on the stage of your product.
I think one of the core things is like you make this a habit. Like that's what you're promoting basically. You're actually focusing on more like the tactics, let's say, than discovery mindset in the book. Like you're I mean, you're going into that as well, obviously. But one thing that I think what I've gotten is like, if you do the habits yourself, which is like the two KPIs that you mentioned, the cycle time between interviews and the time of assumption tests, they're all basically tracking the habits. So you're promoting that if we keep these habits on track, then we'll get the outcome that we want.
I think habits drive mindset. So if you are trying to be fit, if you're unhealthy, if you're physically unfit and you're trying to be fit, you can't start by saying, oh, I'm going to just start thinking healthier. It's not how our brains work, right? We're not going to wake up one day and be like, okay, I'm going to be a healthy person and everything's going to radically change. No, what do we change first? We first change our habits. Maybe we start by looking at how to eat a healthier breakfast. And then we start by looking at how do we eat a healthier lunch. And over time, we develop the mindset and change our relationship with food. Or we start exercising a little bit, and over time, we change our mindsets about physical activity. I think the same is true with discovery. You're not going to suddenly question all of your assumptions. You're not going to suddenly be customer-centric. You're not going to suddenly swim upstream in your organization overnight and adopt all the mindsets. And I do talk about mindsets in the book, like mindsets matter. We have to be customer-centric. We have to be outcome-focused. We have to be visual thinkers. We have to be collaborative, right? The mindsets matter. But I think the way that we develop the mindsets is by starting to change our habits. When we talk to customers on a regular basis, we start to see where we're making wrong assumptions, which means we think about testing our assumptions more. When we talk to customers on a regular basis, we start to realize that we think differently from our customers, and that starts to help us to develop a customer-centric mindset, right? So I think all of us, there's a lot of research on how to adopt habits. We can start small, we can iterate from there. And I think adopting the habits is an easier first step, and the mindsets will follow.
I think one of the things that one of the examples I use is like automating your interview process. Is that you basically give the sales team, the customer support team, let's say, the freedom to put meetings in your calendar, basically. And it reminded me of nudge, of course. Like if you create your defaults towards your desired outcome, then you'll go towards there. That was a very, very interesting tactic. I like the idea of like automating interviews.
That idea actually was inspired by reading the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. So they talk about, can you design a system where it's easier to do the behavior you want to see than the behavior you don't want to see? And this is the heart of habit forming, right? How do I make it easier to get up and work out every day than to not get up and work out every day? Right? And so like an example of that is I might put my workout clothes right next to my bed so that when I get up, I put my workout clothes on. So now it's easier to do that exercise than to not, because if I'm not going to do it, I got to change, right? So it's just little nudges like that of how do we make it easier to adopt the behaviors we want to see. So I want to see teams interviewing every week. Most of us go to the meetings on our calendar. So I started to think about how can we get an interview on our calendar every week without doing anything. And in the book, I share three of the most common ways to do that. And I really do see that when teams automate their recruiting process, they interview every week. It becomes an easy habit to adopt. When they don't, it's a really hard habit to adopt. We're not going to hustle every week to find someone to talk to. We're going to get busy and we're going to skip the interview. And so I think automating the recruiting process is one of the fundamental keys to adopting a continuous cadence.
When you look back over the teams that you worked with, or when you think about this extremely mature, sophisticated discovery team, product team that does discovery really well, what do they look like?
Yeah, you know what? It's not rocket science. They have a very clear idea of what their outcome is. They have instrumentation in place so they're able to measure it. They're interviewing a customer at least once a week, but many of the teams that I work with actually increase that frequency even further. They're processing their interviews as they go, so they're not stopping every 6 interviews to synthesize what they're learning. They're creating interview snapshots after every single interview. After every 3 or 4 interviews, they're revising and evolving their opportunity solution tree. They're updating their experience map. They're always working with a target opportunity and working with a set of solutions. They're running half a dozen to a dozen assumption tests every week, learning about which solutions are going to work best. They're evolving their solutions based on what they're learning. And that sounds like a lot, But when you really internalize the process, this just becomes the way that you think. And most of the teams that I work with, once they're fully ramped up, they're doing all of that in just a couple hours a week. So they're not spending all day, every day in long meetings with each other. They really are, like, the engineer is spending most of their time coding, the designer is spending most of their time designing, the product manager is spending most of their time evaluating metrics, understanding how the product is performing, managing stakeholders, doing all of the product work. But they're getting together every day to move their discovery forward. And it almost becomes like a stand-up, right? Like the trio is meeting a little bit every day, looking at where are we at with our assumption tests, when's our next interview, what of these artifacts do we need to evolve? And they're making incremental progress every single day. And it just becomes a part of the way that they operate.
Do you have a suggestion on how multiple product trios can talk to each other and exchange notes on interviews? Because assuming that every product trio is doing customer interviews, they're going to come across something that might be useful to other product trios as well.
Yeah, so when you interview, you're always going to hear about opportunities that aren't relevant to your outcomes. They might be relevant to another team's outcomes. So what's important is that you have mechanisms in place to share those. And it could be a few things. It could be, I know a lot of teams just make their snapshots public. And you can do this just in Slack or MS Teams, whatever you're using as your kind of team collaboration tool. A lot of teams just have a channel dedicated to what are we learning in interviews? And you can post your interview snapshot there. You can highlight, hey, team A, we think this opportunity might be relevant to you. You might want to listen to the recording of this interview, right? So that there's a really organic sort of working out loud way to continuously share what you're learning and to share your work. I know other teams have a channel dedicated to their discovery. Again, it's Slack channel, MS Teams channel, whatever tool you're using. I know I read Scott Berkin's book about how Automatic works. And at that time, every team had a blog where they were just blogging about what was going on their team. So if I'm a team that has an outlet, whether it's a Slack channel or a blog or whatever your favorite tool is, I would be working out loud. I would be sharing, here's our outcome this quarter. Here's what we learned in this interview this week. Here's the target opportunity we selected and why. Here's the solutions we're considering. And I wouldn't do it as a way of spending a ton of time creating artifacts to document my process. I really like this idea of just working out loud, right? Using it as a way to synthesize what you're learning, synthesize what you're doing, and doing it in a way that's visible to other teams so they can follow along as they have time. And then as a second layer, I would find the right cadence to get everybody together and do a deep dive on one or two teams. And this is a little bit like the design studio critique. Get a team, don't do it as a status update meeting where everybody's sharing their update, but pick one or two teams to do a deep dive on, hey, here's what we learned this quarter, or here's a thorny assumption test we ran, here's what we surprised us. And then let other teams give feedback on their process. And that's also going to help with that cross-team sharing. It's going to help teams get better at their own discovery because they're constantly getting feedback from their peers. And I think if you combine those two methods, you'll have plenty of cross-team sharing.
And you, in the book, you also mentioned that you need to communicate with the other teams as well. I mean, not just product teams or other product trios, but also sales, management, whatever. And I think one thing that I still remember from the book is like or that was from one of your talks. I don't remember. The business team were responsible of the customer. Whereas now we're actually pushing that responsibility towards the builders, which is the product trio. And I think there's also the chance of maybe aligning those two with the opportunity solution, because or visualizing everything, which is what you suggest. I think that's one of the larger challenges as the company grows to a certain scale. There's just so many other people that you need to align that I think just visualizing it on an opportunity solution tree, just that alone creates some sort of clarity.
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about a number of visual artifacts that really are they're designed to help a trio stay aligned. So I don't think about them as like, here's how you're going to document your work. It's more about here's how you're going to do your work to make sure you're really understanding what you know and you're staying aligned as a team. So some of those artifacts are experience maps, opportunity solution trees, interview snapshots, story maps, assumption maps, right? They're all visual artifacts that you're creating while you're doing your discovery work. So And this is a really important distinction. You're not doing your work and then later documenting it, because nobody does that. Right? And we also lose all the messiness and the context and the nuance when we do that. So the idea is that you're visualizing your thinking while you're doing your thinking. That's going to help you be a better thinker, because humans are amazing spatial thinkers. So we want to take advantage of that ability. It's going to help you stay aligned as a trio, because language is vague and visuals really help us make sure we're truly aligned. And a really nice side effect of that is those same visuals can be used for stakeholder management. We might have to simplify them a little bit. We might have to clean up the mess a little bit, but we're not creating separate artifacts to manage stakeholders. We're using the artifacts that we created to do the work to then communicate what we're doing across the organization.
One thing I like about that is that usually customer-facing teams such as sales or customer support, especially in B2B, they usually come with a feature request. They usually come with a specific, I need this. Whereas if you map it out in all those artifacts that you mentioned, that feature is actually a part of something rather than just ultimate request. Like it's one branch in under the outcome. Maybe it's even it's an opportunity. Maybe it's even under the opportunity. Maybe it's like a smaller opportunity, that feature request. So I think that creates the bigger picture understanding in most teams. So that's what I like about it.
Yeah, so I think with sales requests in particular, it's really important to develop that bigger picture, because what tends to happen is one customer requests feature A, another customer requests feature B, another customer requests feature C. All we hear about is A, B, and C. And so what do? We build A, B, and C. What we're missing is that maybe A, B, and C all reflect the same need. Let's say opportunity 1. And then if we dig in and do the work to understand that actually all 3 of these feature requests represent the same need, we actually could come up with solution D that actually is better than A, B, and C, that works better for all 3 of those customers and allows us to build one thing. And so we end up with better solutions, smaller solutions that satisfy more customers.
Yeah, I found that, to be honest, that mindset extremely liberating, because then you're not bound by just a very predetermined outline of what a solution can be, but rather I'm just trying to solve a problem the best way possible. It doesn't have to be A, it doesn't have to be B, it can be something else. And I find that very liberating in terms from a product manager's point of view. But I mean, as I'm speaking right now, I do realize that it's actually a bit unnerving from the sales team, especially for enterprise B2B enterprise software where the customer is demanding hey, you got to give me a date on this feature kind of a thing. So how do you manage that gap, let's say?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to understand the sales perspective, so that what the sales rep wants is to be able to say yes to the customer, right? They're trying to close business. A salesperson's perspective is, I need to close each opportunity that's in front of me, right? So I have a prospect, my job is to close that business. Next prospect, close that business. And so if a customer says, I want feature A, that sales rep wants to say, yes, I can give you feature A by this date, sign the contract. A product team has a different perspective. So the sales team is thinking customer by customer. The product team needs to think about the whole market, right? We can't just close one customer. We have to serve as much of the market as possible by building as little as possible, because that's what's going to allow us to serve more of the market sooner. So what we need to help with that sales rep is we need to work with the customer and really understand the need and help the sales rep see that if we do this work to uncover the opportunity, that you're not going to be able to just say yes to this customer, but you're going to be able to say yes to all these other customers as well. And so we're aligning the product need with the sales rep need, right? Yes, I could just give them feature A and you're going to be able to close that deal. But if I can understand that this really represents opportunity 1, you can close that customer and this other customer over here and this other customer over here and this other customer over here. And that really takes a lot of stakeholder management. So first we have to do the work to understand the customer need and really make sure we have understand the opportunity, and to do the discovery to make sure we're building the right solution. And we have to do the stakeholder work to help the sales rep really see that addressing the opportunity is better for them as well.
Teresa, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been great. I mean, we haven't gotten into the entirety of the book or your ideas, but I think we've talked a lot about a bunch of things, and I strongly recommend everyone to check the book out. I'll put it on the show notes. Its title is Continuous Discovery Habits. Discover products that create customer value and business value. Again, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your experience with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I will just share for folks that are looking for the book. It's available on Amazon properties around the world. If you can't find it on Amazon or Amazon's not available in your region, it should be available from most retailers and even your favorite independent bookstores. It's available via print on demand. So you can actually just go ask them to order it and they should be able to get it for you. It's available in paperback and Kindle and EPUB through other retailers. And it will eventually be available on Audible, but I don't have a timeline for that yet, unfortunately.
All right. And let's talk about the blog as well, the producttalk.org, because I think that's your hub right now.
Yeah.
That's the hub of everything.
Yeah. So I would love it if you would just read the book and you'd be able to put it all into practice and we would change the world together. But I know that's not going to happen because it's hard to apply what you're learning in a book. I will share, I did write the book trying to achieve that goal. And one of my reviewers said most books feel like an advertisement for a workshop, whereas this book feels like it is the workshop. So if you read the book and it's enough, awesome. If that's the case, please write an Amazon review so more people get to experience that. But if that's not the case and you need help putting the habits into practice, along with the book, we've launched a community of people that are working together, trying to put the habits into practice, supporting each other. We do monthly events where we do community coaching calls. We do fireside chats with people who have put the events into practice. You can learn about that at producttalk.org. Look for the header, Find Your People. And then we also, through the Product Talk Academy, have a number of courses that teach you how to adopt the habits and help you build skill in each of the habits. So those resources are available to you if you need help putting the habits into practice. And then of course, there's the blog. There's over 200 articles that will also help you put the habits into practice.
Where everything started.
Where everything started, exactly.
Perfect. Thank you again. And thanks everyone for listening and hope to see you in the next episode.